Assalamu alaikum, good evening. First, I want everyone to kind of take a minute. I need a minute too. That was very, if you feel that in your throat right now, or kind of near your belly or in your chest, allow yourself to cry, allow yourself to grieve. One of the most powerful things that we can do to recognize and assert someone's humanity is actually cry for them, to grieve them. Once we do that, once we've grieved someone, once we've cried for them, we've attached ourselves. We've attached them to us. We don't forget the people that we cry for. On March 24th of last year, Palestinian journalist Hossam Shabat was martyred at the age of 23 when he was targeted and killed by the Israeli occupation forces. We all have had moments throughout these past 3 years that broke something within us, and it broke something within us that can never be fixed. And for me, it was Hussam's murder. But something unexpected happened that day. I received a message from his Twitter account. We had a history of exchanging messages across platforms, and seeing that particular notification made me catch my breath. What if the news of his murder had been wrong? But Hussam was gone. The message from his account was from a friend of his who relayed some things that Hussam had said. And as he was telling me these things, he said in passing that Hussam saw and read everything. In other words, Hussam, like all Palestinian journalists, like all Palestinians we were watching online, wasn't just documenting and sharing the extermination of his people, but was also witnessing in real time the world's most powerful institutions and people debate and dispute whether he and his people could be believed. Hussam saw and read everything. Every inch of our country is complicit, and it's a word that still feels insufficient to describe exactly what we did, what we are doing, what we've allowed, what we have justified, and what we continue to bury every single day. But tonight we speak of the complicity of our storytellers, our institution of journalism, the co-authors of the extermination. In the genocide of the Palestinians, responsibility cannot be confined to the Israeli officials whose specific task was to manufacture post hoc justifications for killing journalists. Obviously, the responsibility for pulling the trigger, firing a missile, or ordering a strike belongs first to the state and the military that carried it out. It also cannot be confined to the American officials who paid for those bullets and bombs, who justified every single bullet and bomb. It cannot be confined to only them, because there is another kind of responsibility that belongs to the institutions that made those killings narratively survivable. If Israel knows that after it kills a Palestinian journalist, it can simply release a dossier, invoke Hamas, circulate a photograph or an alleged intelligence claim, and watch major Western newsrooms reproduce that framing, that is part of the environment in which impunity becomes not only possible, but the only allowed outcome. Journalism is not outside the violence simply because journalists are not the ones who are pulling the trigger. Western media institutions help manufacture the epistemic conditions in which Palestinian journalists could be killed and then discredited after death. For decades, and with a really extraordinary force through this genocide, they trained their audiences, which includes us, to understand Palestinian testimony as inherently suspect and Israeli testimony as inherently credible. A Palestinian is always to be questioned, and an Israeli is always to be believed, no matter what the claim. And we saw this from the very first day that the genocide started. We saw how this was the reality that was being presented to us as the narrative. Palestinian journalists were rarely permitted to just be journalists. They were quote-unquote Hamas-affiliated, Hamas-linked propagandists, or people working in a territory that was, of course, called, a territory quote-unquote controlled by Hamas. And if Hamas is manufactured as being evil incarnate, quote unquote, as our news media helped establish very early on, then what does that make those who are linked to it? And so their photographs, their reporting, and even their deaths were subjected to standards of proof that Israeli claims were almost never required to meet. When Israel accused a journalist of being a militant, major news organizations often reproduced the accusation before any evidence could even be presented or verified, if even relevant, allowing the accusation itself to become part of the public record. And Israel's so-called legitimization cell, the military unit that worked to link Palestinian journalists to armed resistance, this was specifically a group that was formed following October 7th, did not create this vulnerability from nothing. It operated inside a media environment that our institutions had been building for decades. Israel was thus not only treated as just one party among two competing accounts, it was made the final authority over Palestinian reality. The state killing Palestinians was also granted the power to narrate their deaths. It was the primary, if not only credible narrator. And of course, this belongs to a much longer history in which Palestinians have been denied the authority to explain their own lives. And they've been instead transformed into these unreliable narrators who are not trusted to narrate their own conditions, their own oppression, their own extermination. And that's why preserving the record matters. Remembering who these heroes, the greatest journalists of our time, were matters. Their lives mattered and still matter, even in their deaths. Their lives matter, their dreams matter, their hopes, wishes, fears, all of these things matters, and every single one of these testimonies matter. And we have to remember not only those who were killed, but what was said about them before and after. Which accusations were published? Whose claims were granted authority? Which images were withheld? Which deaths were rendered in the passive voice? Which editors insisted that there was not yet enough evidence to name what Palestinians could already see happening? Not enough evidence to tell us who the perpetrators were, even as the perpetrators themselves boasted of their slaughter. The archive must include, the ultimate archive that we create about this extermination, about this genocide, must include the journalism itself about it. Institutional memory has a way of turning the perpetrators of crimes into witnesses themselves, and the participants in those crimes into just mere observers. Our power, which we have a lot of, our power lies in refusing that laundering, in preserving the names, headlines, broadcasts, silences, and testimonies, and ensuring that those who help to make Palestinian truth and thus Palestinian life disposable do not get to appoint themselves as the custodians of its history. I want to end with just one quick anecdote about Hussam, and just to let you know a bit more about what kind of a young man he was, and also for perspective, he was 19, 20 years old when the genocide started. So that is an unfathomable burden to take on, I think, for anyone, but especially so for someone living in those conditions at that age. Hossam, was able to make some money through his efforts, of course, as a journalist. And he used that money to feed everyone around him, family or not. And he would feed them, when he was especially in northern Gaza during the siege, I remember, he would just seek money so that he could feed the children and the people around him, because of course it was under siege and people were being starved in addition to being bombed and slaughtered in all the different ways the Israeli occupation forces were doing. And the way that he would feed himself, he would just keep a piece of stale bread in his pocket the entire day that he would just nibble throughout the day to keep his hunger satiated. That's who Hossam Shabat was. Not only one of the greatest journalists that we have had the true blessing to witness, but he was a beautiful soul and a young boy who had dreams and wishes like every other boy, every other girl, and everyone else in this world. So, thank you.